bahsediyor olacağız. Biliyorsunuz aslında siber güvenlik dediğimizde işte bir tarafta hackerlar sürekli yeni teknikler, saldırı teknikleri bulurken ve diğer taraftan da siber güvenlikçiler bu saldırıları engellemek için yeni teknikler ve savunma araçları üretirken bu karşılıklı bir kedi fare oyununa dönmüş ve aslında iki tarafta birbirini geliştiriyor durumda. Tabii bu süreçte biz siber güvenlikçilerin en çok işine yarayan konular, teknikler ve araçlar bulunmakta. Bu araçlar arasında bazı ofansif security araçları, yani biz siber güvenlikçiler olarak kendi siber güvenliğimizi tıpkı bir hacker gibi test ederek açıkları bulduğumuz araçlar olduğu gibi aynı zamanda savunma tarafında olan da bazı araçlar bulunmakta. Tabii bu araçları birlikte kullanıyor olmak bizim siber güvenliğimizde arttıran durumlardan birisi oluyor. Ve bu araçlar bazen siber güvenlikçiler için geliştiriliyor olsa da bir süre sonra saldırganlar da aslında siber güvenlikçiler için geliştirilen ofansif araçları da kullanıyor oluyorlar. Bu oturumda Amerika'dan konferansımıza katılım sağlayan Daniel Bohan'ın daha önceden de hem FireEye Mandiant'ta hem de Microsoft'ta Principal Threat Researcher, yani baş siber güvenlik araştırmacısı olarak çalışan ve şu anda Permiso Security Amerika'daki bir cloud security, bulut güvenliği firmasının yine baş araştırmacısı olan Daniel Bohan'ını misafir edeceğiz. Ve Daniel Bohan'ın bu oturumunda Defending Against Tomorrow Attacks Using Today's Tools, yani bugünün araçlarını kullanarak yarının saldırılarına karşı nasıl savunma yaparız, bundan bahsedecek. Ve ben Daniel'ı sahneye davet ediyorum.
Teşekkürler. İyi günler. Nasılsınız? İyi misin? İyi misiniz? Sorry. Türkçe çok zor. Benim adım Daniel Bohan'ın. Ben Amerikalıyım ama az Türkçe konuşabilirim. I'm always happy to be back here in Turkey. From me to you, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I hope you find this talk enjoyable. So, bugün defending against tomorrow's attacks using today's tools. In this presentation, I'm going to share kind of the context of my background in cybersecurity, and I'm going to look at some of the trends that I've observed over the last 10 years in defensive tooling, offensive tooling, attacker TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then looking at what's next. What is the tomorrow? What do we do with this information as defenders, as ethical hackers, to ultimately use our knowledge and our power that comes from knowledge to make the world a better place. I'm a principal security researcher at Permiso Security. We're a cloud security startup based in the US, but with people fully remote all around the world. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I try my best to answer anyone who reaches out as best I can with my time, and so we'll have this slide towards the end as well. I've been in the IT industry for 13 years. The last 10 years I've been full-time in information security. I studied computer science at the University of Georgia, where I'm currently living, and my master in information security from the Georgia Institute of Technology. My first role was not security. I was just a database administrator, and I got into security through a teammate running Mimikatz on my system, which is a very well-known password dumping tool. And his friendship is really what got me interested in security and what led me to study it and then move into a security role. So most of my career, I've been on the defensive side of security. In 2015 through 2020, I worked for a company called Mandiant. At the time, was part of FireEye, but last year Google acquired Mandiant, and I was an incident response consultant. So we were kind of the firefighters of the cyber world. When companies were hacked, They would call us, and we would respond and help them understand what happened and how they can remove the attacker from their environment and make themselves more secure. This is where I had a really, really incredible view into the world's best hackers and nation-state threat actors. And so towards the end, we talk about threat actor TTPs and their behaviors and their tooling. A lot of that experience comes from responding to them at Mandiant, while also working at Microsoft for a few years as a threat hunter and security researcher. One of the things that's been really important in my career, both personally and professionally, is open source tools. In 2016 and 2017, I started to really become interested in obfuscation techniques and evasion techniques, particularly because I was seeing how attackers were using this language called PowerShell to do really, really amazing and creative things, specifically to evade detections. So I released these tools, and this is what got me interested in security research and giving presentations. But something very interesting happened. A few months after releasing that tool, we were working an investigation, and I saw a nation-state threat actor that had used my tool, and we were investigating what they'd done with it. For about 1 minute, this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Everyone in my office was like, whoa, that's so cool. But then I immediately felt really bad because I didn't create that tool for this threat actor to do bad things with. And so what I decided to do next was to focus more on defensive research. So I teamed up with a guy named Lee Holmes at Microsoft who helped develop the PowerShell language. And we worked on some defensive capabilities using data science and machine learning techniques. So all that to say, I've had a very tool-centric focus on obfuscation, evasion, both from an offensive and a defensive perspective. So throughout this talk, this is kind of the context of where my experience is. I always like to preface that because just because I say something, it comes from my line of experience. And so I welcome you to always ask other people their experiences so that you have a more complete picture of the security industry, the trends, the patterns, and the things that you should focus on going forward. So how do I summarize the last 10 years of tooling trends and experience in only 30 minutes? Well, çok. So first, let's talk about defensive tooling. Everyone kind of, when I look at the trends of our defensive tooling, everything really started with, network scanning, vulnerability scanning, patch management. These are very important things today, but the industry realized that, this is looking for known bad things, signatures. But what about the things that you don't know about? The known unknowns? What about patterns you don't know about? And so kind of this is point in time as well, because what about the activity between scan A and scan B? What activity occurred there that we don't see as defenders? And so the industry kind of moved forward and said, all right, we need more real-time visibility. At a basic level, what are the processes that are being executed on a system? Do we know of their file hashes or any signatures that cause us concern that maybe we shouldn't have that run? And at a basic level, it's still looking for known bad. It's still looking for known bad strings, known bad file hashes, etc. And this also led into something called application block listing. And from my perspective, at the time, I've seen very few companies implement this well. Application block listing basically says, you can only run the things that we allow you to run. If you're not on this list, or your signer is not on this list, then you can't run. I think a lot of attackers assumed that defenders would be really good at implementing this, and so they decided to shift from the capability of creating custom binaries and executing them on disk to saying, how can we utilize this concept of living off the land? What this means is, what are the native signed binaries on the operating system I want to attack that I can execute, but have it in memory retrieve my payload, maybe from a remote location or from another script file? And so as defenders now, that real-time visibility becomes tricky because we can't just look at a file hash. The file hash is still good. It's still the signed correct binary, but now its behavior is different. And so we kind of saw you can't just say this file is good or bad. You have to look at the actions. What's inside of it? If you have the ability to inspect the process memory, these are the kinds of additional visibility that the defensive community realized that we needed to get. Because you can only detect what you can see. And if you can't see something, how do you get that visibility? So we kind of shift from real-time basic, as I would call it, to real-time behavior. and looking for suspicious patterns of behavior. Again, if you have things like inspection of process memory, those are all pieces of information that are quite helpful. The next step is what I would kind of consider more real-time advanced. Up until this point, AV has been a bit focused on executables. But as living off the land binaries came into play, it also introduced things like living off the land scripts. You know, what are script files that you can hijack in terms of search order hijacking or side loading or different techniques like that. And so you see the EDR industry, or the endpoint detection and response, try to give defenders the extra visibility into things like beyond file creation. What about registry modifications? Or what about visibility into ETW streams? ETW on Windows is event tracing for Windows, and you can think about it like a sink, a water faucet, and all the information that ends up in event logs has to come through ETW. And so defenders, I mean, ETW has been around for 20 or 30 years with Microsoft operating the Windows operating system, but defenders discovered it. But attackers also realize that they can attack it. So if attackers can turn off that visibility, we as defenders lose that visibility. EDRs also brought in better visibility into behaviors outside of just processes. As you started to see network connections become more and more encrypted with things like Let's Encrypt, it made HTTPS ubiquitous for attackers. And so traditional network signatures had to adapt as well. But EDRs allowed you to pair a network connection, usually not the content of the packets, but the connection details itself. You can connect that with the process that is making the connection. And so it kind of allowed more data points for defenders to piece together to find malicious activity. And so everything I've talked about so far is defensive tooling on the endpoint, on the host-based and network-based kind of on-premise environment. For the last year, I've shifted into cloud security research, and we're seeing the same kinds of maturity pattern play out. You see initially cloud security, things like CSPMs, or cloud security posture management, kind of feels like Nessus vulnerability scanning, but it's point in time. What about all the activity occurring between scan A and scan B? Well, we need that same runtime visibility, that real-time visibility, and then once the industry has that visibility, well, I want preventative options. I want to be able to respond to those actions that we find to be suspicious. So we kind of predict that there's going to be similar trends in the cloud that we have seen on-prem over the last 10 plus years. So that was a very, very quick overview of defensive tooling over the last 10 years. When it comes to offensive tooling, before we move forward, we have to remember that offensive tooling must be talked about in dark mode. How do a lot of people get into offensive security? I think one of the most common tools that people learn on is Metasploit. There are many different tools you can learn on, but this is one that, at least in my experience, has been pretty common. So Metasploit is an open source framework. It also has a paid commercial version owned by the company named Rapid7. But basically, it's a CLI tool, a command line interface tool, and it does a lot of things. It allows you to scan and look for certain vulnerabilities for a target system that you want to try to exploit. It then offers you those exploitation modules, so you can choose an exploitation that matches the vulnerability that you found. You can then execute that. And then once you actually exploit the vulnerability, well, what do you want to do with that? What additional payload do you want to run? And there's a whole set of modules for payloads. So it really brought all these components into one place and allowed, with a free open source tool, for people to start learning how to actually use some of these attacks. And so people that use this, there was another tool in the Kali Linux distribution, which is a very popular security Linux distribution. There's another cool tool named Armitage by a guy named Raphael Mudge. And he had this idea to have this kind of gooey look to the systems that he has access to. And he liked the idea so much that he went off and created his own company and developed a tool called Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike is a commercial pen testing tool, and it is dominated in the last 8 or 9 years. And so a lot of my introduction into writing detections and threat hunting has been against both red teamers pen testers, and nation-state threat actors using Cobalt Strike, either cracked versions of Cobalt Strike or legitimate licensed versions in the red team scenarios. But it now gave you the same command line access with a GUI. And so like in this example, you might have to chain access between multiple systems to get around a firewall. But what's really cool is it also gives you more of a GUI feel for doing additional data gathering as well as post-exploitation. So I can right-click on one of my sessions and say, show the current processes on this system. Maybe there are 3 of us on a team and we're all red teaming together. Well, we all have access to this, and we can just say, let me take this one system and let me right-click on it and do some, dump some credentials or take screenshots. And this trend was quite interesting because for many years, Cobalt Strike was kind of seen as one of the hardest things to detect. Even I kind of entered the industry thinking it was something that was just undetectable. But as the defensive tooling capabilities increased, well, the industry started to find patterns on how Cobalt Strike implemented some of these modules. And this is not just Cobalt Strike. This is any of the offensive tools. The more visibility you have, the more you see it, the better you can be at finding those patterns. And as a defensive researcher, finding patterns is crucial. So we saw this trend as defensive tools started to be able to detect the way that some of these backdoors operated. The offensive security said, well, what if we don't use the default ways to run these commands? And what if we build our own modules for different post-exploitation? So the plug-and-play post-exploitation modules has been a very interesting shift because now it's not sufficient just to say, this threat actor uses Cobalt Strike. But you can start to say, this threat actor uses Cobalt Strike with these custom configurations. Or they like to use module A and B before they use module F and G. And so it allowed us to have more fingerprints of the way that the attacker operated. Just like with defensive tooling, we have to move away from a binary that's running and look at the behaviors that originate out of that binary. This is just a very brief list of some of the common offensive security tools, as well as different languages and some of the post-exploitation modules. And I list this because, we start with Metasploit, which is written in Ruby. Cobalt Strike was written in Java. You have things like Empire, the PowerShell and Python version. But as I mentioned, these post-exploitation tools, a lot of these backdoors use PowerShell to run those tools. And the reason was because 6 or 7 years ago, if you remember from the defensive tooling slides, people were shifting to living off the land, and they were moving all these post-exploitation tools into PowerShell. Because PowerShell is installed, signed, native Windows binary. It's there by default on Windows 7 and later. And older versions of PowerShell did not have good defensive logging. I could talk for a while about PowerShell event logging. If you're interested in that after this talk, I'd be happy to chat about it. But attackers realized we had built, as a community, we've built all these amazing post-exploitation modules, but now the language we wrote them in, PowerShell, defenders are getting really good at that visibility. They're getting really good at writing detections for it. And they're actually catching our usage of these backdoors now, not just because of the backdoor itself, but because they're getting good at detecting these post-exploitation modules because of the language we wrote it in. So attackers said, we need to port and convert and translate our tools to a language that does not give defenders that edge, that extra capability. And the language that a lot of people decided to shift to was C#. One reason is because PowerShell is actually written in C#. So they basically just abstracted it down one layer and started converting all these tools to C#. What this allowed, it kind of extended the life of these backdoors because an attacker could start to bring in better languages without that defensive visibility, and now they can keep running their favorite post-exploitation tools without being detected by that tool. And eventually, this led to people saying, well, why don't we just develop our own backdoor? Particularly in a language maybe that is a little more obscure, maybe something like NIM or something newer like Rust that defenders aren't quite looking at yet. Now, it's not an easy thing just to go and build an entire backdoor. You can build a very simple one, but people have become very reliant on all these free tools that the community had developed. And people were extending some of these frameworks, but ultimately a lot of the central ways these tools operated were still detectable by defensive tooling. So what did attackers do then? If now everyone has started from using all these crazy custom malicious binaries, but then because of application blocklisting, they've kind of filtered themselves into saying we want to focus on these living off the land binaries, and they built all these plug and play modules to stick in all along the way, but then at some point the defensive visibility caught up, and now a lot of these attackers are operating in this very small circle of activity, and they have to break back out again. From an intel perspective, operating in that small cylinder of activity it's good. It simplifies detections for defenders, but it complicates attribution, which we'll talk about in just a few slides. So when I say attacker TTPs, again, this is based on my experience from incident response and threat hunting and threat research at Mandiant and Microsoft over the last 7.5 years. So when I say attackers, I mean nation-state threat actors. Red teamers and pen testers, as well as your more financial threat actors, or sometimes what people would label as commodity malware developers and campaigns. And TTP is an industry term for tactics, techniques, and procedures. So what are the kinds of things that an attacker does, regardless of the tools that they use? So some of the trends that I've seen has been, one, a big shift towards process injection and hollowing. This kind of goes hand in hand with some of the living off the land techniques, but basically even if an attacker knows the first part of their attack will be detected, they immediately want to move their capabilities into another process, so that even if a defender detects the first process and maybe kills that process, the attacker still has that capability, command and control, that C2 access in another process. And there's a lot of techniques that good attackers will use to spread their access across multiple processes, eventually multiple systems, so that a defender might feel confident that they've remediated the issue by stopping one part, but they're completely blind to the second part and the attacker is already long gone. The next one is hide in plain sight. This was something that I loved talking with our red team about when I was at Mandiant, was saying as a defender, there are some problems that are a lot harder to solve than others. For example, lateral movement in Windows using WMI, or Windows Management Instrumentation. An amazing tool, an amazing capability. Attackers use it all the time. Sysadmins use it all the time. So it's a hard problem to solve. If an attacker can build tooling in areas that are very noisy, then they have a better chance of not being detected as easily, or at least making us as defenders have to work harder to write a detection that has high fidelity. As we mentioned in the previous slides, retooling in languages that have less visibility. Shifting from everything being written in PowerShell to maybe C#, or maybe Python, or maybe NIM or Rust. And this causes there to be a lot of rework. Telemetry tampering. What if I like my PowerShell post-exploitation modules? Can I find a way just to turn off that visibility? And there's lots of ways to do that. Things like AMSI bypasses, which is the anti-malware scan interface that Microsoft added, not just for PowerShell, but for things like JavaScript and VBScript. And there's a whole kind of genre of security called anti-forensics as well, for looking for an attacker that understands forensic artifacts that are created during attacks, and then finding ways of removing that trail after they've performed their malicious activity. And this also got quite interesting when you added more and more defensive agents to a system. Now it's no longer enough for an attacker to delete event logs after they're performing their attack. Well, yeah, you might have deleted the local event logs, but maybe those event logs were already forwarded off to a syslog server. Or maybe there was also an EDR agent that has forwarded those logs to the cloud, to the security vendor to look at. And so attackers had to basically get really good at, as soon as you get access to a system, quickly fingerprinting and figuring out what are all the areas of visibility on the system, and how do I sinkhole those communications? How do I blind the attacker? How do I blind the defensive visibility so that I can then perform my malicious activity without being detected? This shift kind of to open source tools and then back away from open source tools has been really interesting, mainly from an attribution perspective. There's been actually some really interesting examples of nation-state threat actors that have developed quite impressive capabilities 100% by using open source tools. It also makes it kind of tricky to attribute who a threat actor is just based on the tools when everyone is using the same tools. On the flip side, as attackers now have started to develop their own in-house backdoors that are all customized, it's harder to find them the first time because you don't have the benefit of there being a lot of similarities. But once you find them, if you know that threat actor is the only threat actor in the world that has developed this tool and they're not sharing it with anyone else, that becomes a much stronger indicator of attribution whenever you see that tool being used or that technique being used. And so there's this really fascinating element of humanity that comes as a threat researcher, because at the end of the day, I'm studying techniques and I'm studying creative patterns that another human somewhere in the world has written and put into a tool to accomplish their objectives. So that's always really cool to me. At the end of the day, it's about securing information, and information is transferred from one human to another, and all of us just exist in seeing those bytes as they go back and forth. MFA push fatigue, there's been a lot of additional preventative measures that I've seen become more common in the defensive community. But attackers, they have to change their techniques a little bit, but from a psychological perspective, they can still very easily get in by sending someone 150 push notifications in the middle of the night until the person finally just accepts. So there's always still a human element to security, both from a security education and training perspective, as well as just making sure that we perform, that we have defense in depth when we're planning and implementing security measures at our organizations. Lastly, specializations and outsourcing. Some attack groups are a couple college kids. Some attack groups are like an enterprise. They might literally have front companies that they're hiring and saying, hey, come do pen testing for our company. And the students think they're working for a real company, but they're actually hacking into different companies without even realizing that they're part of illegal activity. That's not a super common thing, but we've seen it happen more than once. Also, I might not like this company right here, and I might not want to take the time to try to break into that company. I might just ask around and see who has access already. We see this a lot with commodity malware. As defenders, it's boring to see commodity malware again and again and again, and sometimes we might choose to ignore it. But just because that commodity malware is commodity today and is only mining Bitcoin, for example, that access is on the dark web somewhere. And someone might say, hey, there's a Bitcoin miner on this device in the organization that I want to attack, and they might pay $10 or €100 to then get access to that Bitcoin miner, and now they have full access to the system, and the behavior of that process is completely different. And we've seen that happen with the change of shifts of the behaviors because that access has been bought and sold. Lastly, we've investigated some incidents recently where we'll see maybe an attacker has compromised an environment, they've stolen a lot of data, but they don't want to perform ransomware, but they'd sure like to get the customer's attention, so they'll outsource ransomware and extortion to another, to another gang, a cyber gang that specializes in that activity. So there's an entire ecosystem in the marketplace that attackers are starting to do by specializing in one thing and then providing that as a service to all the other criminal groups or threat actor groups. So that was a lot of information. What next? What does all this mean going forward? What are the predictions? And what do we do with this information, especially as we think from an education perspective in the information security community? The biggest thing I like to tell people is use what you have. You have to start somewhere. So what visibility do you currently have when you're writing detections or when you're doing research? And then if there is an attack that you can't detect based on your current visibility, how do you get additional visibility? What additional visibility exists? In your organization, can you just go buy a tool to get that visibility? Is there an open source project you can use to get that visibility or that preventative capability? Or do you need to build it yourself? And these are all business decisions for large companies, but I guarantee you that while it might seem frustrating, if you're stuck and you can't just buy a tool, if you had to build it yourself, you're going to learn so much from that. And in the future, if you work at a company and you can buy the tool, then you have a better idea of how much work it would have taken to get that visibility. and that will help justify the cost or the negotiations in that process. So I've been on all aspects of that spectrum, and I've been frustrated at times, but I've learned so much in the process. And the way I like to think about it is, sometimes if you are constrained and you really know the right answer is to have this visibility, but you only have this visibility, that breeds creativity. Okay, these are the cards I've been dealt. How can I solve my problem just with this visibility? So don't discount constraint, because it really gives you new ideas and allows you to think differently than others. Defenders, we have to stay on top of new tools and new techniques that are being talked about and used in the industry. This is where things like staying active on Twitter or Reddit or Medium or LinkedIn and following what researchers are sharing, because threat actors do that as well. I've seen researchers post a technique, and within 2 hours, threat actors are already using it in the wild. So if threat actors see that information as being valuable, we as the defensive community should also do that. And as the ethical hackers, the offensive community, you should also be staying on top of the new tools and trends so that you can help your customers and your clients become aware of those patterns and activities. And the very last one is invest in your people. Tools are amazing. I've worked for tool companies. I currently am at a tool company, but the people are the most important thing. My father was a software engineer his whole life, and he's retired now, and he said, son, never burn a bridge, because you will work with the same people your whole life. We have to help each other. As a security community, there's always a bigger problem to solve than the resources that we currently have. And investing in people also means being generous with your time. Like, you might know things that someone else doesn't. Take your time to invest in them. Answer questions, make yourself available. And don't demean someone or make them feel silly for asking a basic question. We all started there. And so I guarantee you that if you invest your time in others, then the reward of seeing someone else realize their potential is far more valuable than any salary or position or accolade that I could imagine. So with that, I want to say çok teşekkürler. I've really been my honor to be here, and I think at this point we can maybe take a few questions if anyone is interested. Teşekkürler.
Evet, sorular için vaktimiz var. Alabiliriz.
Yes.
And Rust. But well, in the first place, the reason why attackers have gone into PowerShell was living off the land. And if we just go to Rust and NIM, then wouldn't it be avoiding living off the land, and then just cannot avoid block listing?
Yeah, no, that is an excellent question and a very astute observation. So I mean, the question began with, if attackers were shifting everything to PowerShell to get the benefits of living off the land, then if they now move out to writing their custom binaries in NIM and Rust and everything else, aren't they losing that advantage? I would say yes, but I think the difference is that advantage ended up not being as useful as they thought it would be. Because I think attackers started to shift to living off the land a lot because they assumed that application block listing would become more common, but it is extremely hard to do well. I've only seen a handful of organizations really implement it, because if you think about, if everyone in this room, if we all work for a company, think about how different we all are, all the different kinds of patterns and activities, and the different tools that one person might need the other person doesn't. So, I mean, it requires, in the cases where I've seen it done successfully, it requires teams of people just to handle what happens when this person wants to run a tool we've never seen before. Do we call them on the phone? Do we ask them questions to make sure it's really them? If it is really them, what if they downloaded a malicious binary and they're accidentally running it? So I think a lot of companies realized we can't maintain application block listing, and they either gave up or they just implemented it in kind of like monitor mode, which meant that attackers could still run their own binaries. And I think so many attackers started to move to running things in PowerShell that the defensive community, we got really good at detecting a lot of that stuff. And attackers realized, you know what, the benefits we thought we were getting out of looking like everyone else is really hurting us, so we're going to shift back out and look totally different and just try to hide and not be seen. So yeah, I think, yeah, it's a really good question. And hopefully that answered it a little bit.
Yes, that was a good answer. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Good question. Yes.
I just wanted to ask that you talk about Metasploit, etc. Some of the, I can say, sector standard programs for last decade. I wanted to ask, I'm not in the industry right now, I'm a student, but you're in the industry right now. Are the penetration testing companies using Metasploit like popular exploiting tools right now? Or just these are used by amateurs?
Yeah. No, very good question. Most of the companies I've seen as of the last year or two, honestly, are still using Cobalt Strike. They're using it in a very obscure way in that they're not using any of the default capabilities, but all of the post-exploitation modules are written in C#. I mean, Cobalt Strike even came up with a concept they call BOF. I'm actually blanking on the first one. It's something object. If anyone knows it, feel free to shout it out. But they made it easy to package custom tooling that's already pre-compiled to execute on a system. So then even the compilation artifacts aren't generated, which is something I loved looking for. So I think a lot of pen testing companies are still able to use Cobalt Strike. I only know of one or two that use Metasploit, but they use the paid version, and they've gotten really good at using it in very customized ways, or they patch it themselves to remove the indicators that they know defenders use to detect. There's a smaller numbers of more boutique security companies that write their own backdoors because it's a huge investment. I mean, a company could invest $1 million for several people to write this code for a year or two, and companies that do that typically only use that when they need to. So if most of their customers still get all the benefit and aren't great at detecting Cobalt Strike, use Cobalt Strike. But when you get that one customer that says, we're going to pay you a lot of money, and you better give us the best thing you have because I better not see you use Cobalt Strike or Metasploit because we know what that looks like. That customer, you might go into your vault, get that $1 million backdoor and use that. So I've kind of seen that pattern play out as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. Yep.
Firstly, I want to thank you for this presentation. I'm an electric and electronic students, and I'm interested in the hacking, ethical hacking, but I want to now we talk about the softwares, but I want to say you, do you know any information about the hardwares like hacking RF? Because this industry is increasing that this part of the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good question. I would say I don't have any direct experience, but like if you're talking about hardware hacking or like, well, like hardware hacking is like how do you take an IoT device and how do you perform, let's say, pen testing against that device to find vulnerabilities. But then you have people that are into like physical security, and yes, maybe they know how to use Metasploit, but they have to figure out how do I break into that room and get access to that server. And those people also develop hardware tools to have, you know, malicious USBs, or maybe they might make keyboards that have a malicious chip in there so they can have access whenever someone plugs it in. So resources for learning that, that's a great question. I actually don't know. I know there's a hardware-specific security conference. I think it's called hardware.io. I think it shifts between India and Europe. But yeah, I think my advice would be like, you know, try to find some of the people on Twitter that talk about hardware, RFID attacks and things like that. There's a guy named Deviant Olem, and he has some really incredible talks on physical social engineering and like breaking into physical locations. And so if that's more of what, like, that's not exactly hardware, but yeah, there's a couple different areas similar to that. I'm sorry, I feel like that wasn't the best answer to your question, but feel free to talk afterwards, and we can exchange information, and I'll try to figure out what would be most helpful in terms of connecting you with those resources. So, teşekkürler.
Thank you.
Yes, well, one behind there.
Hi. As you said too, like defenders can do some stuff before the attack happens, like think of them and think of what attack can happen and like make them not happen, but they can like. Sorry, I couldn't
No.
make my sentence. I got excited.
No problem deal. You're braver than I am. As you saw how little Turkish I spoke today.
So defenders have like two options if we make it simpler. They can be ready for any attack. Like they can be ready for attacks, but they're almost like infinite ways to attack. So
Yes.
it seems like adding up exponential numbers one by one.
Yes.
But they can wait for the attack and like get rid of it as fast as they can.
Yes.
But they can lose too. So which way do you think is more reasonable?
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. If you think about it for too long as a defender, you normally get sad. But then you have to remember, okay, how do I make progress? I think this is where a thoughtful usage of data science, machine learning, AI, like move beyond the buzzwords, but actual applications of it become really important. Because to your point, if we're only looking for the things we know about, then we miss everything else. And so you can kind of take the inverse approach, which says baseline, that's what application block listing is, baseline everything you know, and then anything that's different, I want to have as an alert or prevent, et cetera. But from a data science perspective, you can say, yes, maybe we can detect this technique through known signatures, through a known AV, known EDR, known network. But what are other ways we can describe that behavior? How can we, it's called like feature engineering. What are other ways we can describe that to detect it in a reasonable way? Because then when the attacker makes small changes, you'll still detect it. So like, for example, if I met you and wanted to ask how you're doing, I could say, ne yapıyorsun, or ne yapıyorsun, or ne haber. So we all understand that I'm asking of your well-being, but is there a way that you can classify that? We'll both start with the question of ne. Both of them are directed towards a single person, informal. And so you could start to say, like, if the first interaction of two people involves those elements of the language, we can categorize this as an introduction. So it's a very abstract way of thinking about not just looking for certain words, but looking for patterns. And you can do the same thing with processes, network connections, behaviors. If a new process is executed for the first time by a parent-child process relationship, by a user that just logged in from a type 3 login, and they're talking to an IP address over a port you've never seen before, all those things in combination can come together in what we call weak signals. Each one is a weak signal, not enough by itself, but if you combine them together, it can become enough to generate an alert. And I've seen some really cool applications of data science that help you find those features, because computers can find, humans are amazing at finding patterns, and if you can work with the computer to help it generate those patterns and features, then you can do some really cool detections. And at that point, you'll see data science algorithms and machine learning and supervised models say, this is malicious, and then the only challenge becomes, it is malicious, but how do I explain how the machine found that was malicious? So I hope that answered your question in trying to engineer the unknown things, because at the end of the day, we can't keep up just with signatures for the known patterns. But yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Choki. Man, the front row has so many good questions. Actually, I should ask, how are we on time?
We have two more questions.
Two more questions. Yep. Okay, no pressure. Is there anyone in the back? No? Okay, I see one right here. There's a couple rows. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Yeah. Right back there. No, thank you for the questions. This is fun. And I'll be in the back afterwards as well, so I look forward to keeping the conversation going. Yes.
Hello. Are development in AI tools making cybersecurity researchers' life easier or more challenging? Because hackers can use for undetectable usage and making their tools more powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, any capability will have pros and cons. So last week I was having some conversations about the use of LLMs, large language models like ChatGPT for phishing attacks. I've gotten some amazing phishing emails in the last month. I mean, really impressive. And I'm a paranoid person, so I don't think I've received one I didn't recognize, but it was astounding at how good it was. To the average user, there's very little chance that they'd be able to differentiate. I mean, it was quite good. And also it allows someone to be able to target their to target in a specific language, even if I don't speak that language. If the LLM is good, then I can now speak that language in an email. And so it avoids a lot of the simple spelling errors and grammatical errors. Also, it allows attackers to speed up recon. You used to have to understand how to use all these tools to profile someone's LinkedIn, to look for what employees have access to interesting information. Now you can just point ChatGPT and say, go get this information and find the most suitable person for me to target and craft the email referencing recent LinkedIn posts they've done or YouTube videos they've given presentations about. I mean, that's how good my phishing email was. It was linking all this stuff. It was appealing to the human emotion of, you gave this great talk, all this stuff. And come to find out, they targeted 3 of us in the organization very specifically. So yeah, that's the kind of downer that makes a defender sad. But what are creative ways that defenders can use that? Well, how do you profile? How do you make baselining easier? How do you profile user behaviors? None of these are easy, so I don't want to make it sound like those are not challenging, because they are. But I think as the defensive industry, we need to make sure that we share those success stories and the failures so that we can all learn together to harness that power for good.
Thank you.
But yeah, excellent question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Son soruyu alalım.
So many questions. Let's do one from this side, because I feel like we've been on this side. So this is the last question, is that correct?
Yes.
One? Okay. This hand went up really high, very eagerly, so.
Thank you for choosing me. And I want to question about 2 questions about that topic, if you have time.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, as the Aselsan Vocational and Anatolian High School student and Savtech Club member, I want to ask a question about Cobalt Strike. Isn't Cobalt Strike teaching something which not legal things to attackers, if it not how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say any of these tools can be used for good or bad. So I mean, the question kind of becomes, is it ethical for us to share knowledge that can be used for good or bad? I think that question is as old as humanity, but it feels different in the security world, because a lot of people, when they hear the word hacker, they think of something bad. I think of the word hacker as someone that has to take something apart and figure out how it works. You know, like social media has life hacks. Like, that's a hacker. They're figuring out a way to do something faster. And so I think there are certain lines, ethical lines, that we should say, should I share a technique that will be so detrimental to everyone in the world and defenders can't detect it? Do I need to do that just so I can get some followers on Twitter? Or can I leverage the relationships I have and say, who are the companies in the world I need to connect with, and say, I have some information that is going to be devastating. How can I ethically share this information so that you all can be aware of it and we can come up with a solution before in just releasing this out? And so I think those relationships become really important for that.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
And second question is AI and quantum computers, how will be affected by, not affected by, affected to defensive software, and it will be, where it will be go, and that's the question, I think, second.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question to end on. I would say, I mean, when I was in university, quantum computing was just, it was just a topic, right? So I don't have any direct experience. I'll be the first to admit that. But I think for any new disruptive technology, like you know, even specific applications like ChatGPT, like we talked about, I think the bad scenarios will always come out first, because people are going to be opportunistic and look for ways to make money or to help themselves at the expense of others. But as more people realize that it's not the technology, the knowledge, the technique is not bad, it's how you use it, then I hope that defenders will embrace it as well, to understand and think through creative ways of solving those problems. So where do I think it will go? I don't know. I hope it goes somewhere good, and I hope that we have creative people who can take on new challenges and ask those questions. And certainly having bright minds asking these questions in high school is a very good sign. And so I'm hopeful for the future in the creativity that you all bring. So, çok teşekkürler.
I thank you too, and thank you too for your answers. Can we share our LinkedIn
yes.
before the?
Yeah, actually, is it okay if we put the slide back up? I think the very first and last slide has the contact information. We'll get that up here in a second, or feel free to reach out to me in the back and I can give you a business card. But
Sorularınız için teşekkür ederim arkadaşlar. Gerçekten güzel sorulardı. Daha çok sorularınız olduğunuzu biliyorum. Çıkışta Daniel burada olacak.
Until the chai runs out. So I'll be here until then. No, maybe 30 minutes or something like that. 30 dakika olur mu? Tamam.
Evet.
Süper.
Daniel'a konuşması için çok teşekkür ederiz.
Teşekkürler. Teşekkürler.
Şimdi ara vermeden aslında son soruyla da ilgili. Yapay zeka dil modelleri siber güvenliği nasıl etkiliyor? Bununla ilgili bir panelimiz olacak.